I'd now like to introduce our second speaker this evening, John Lonsdale, Emeritus Professor of Modern African History at the University of Cambridge and Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge. His publications include Unhappy Valley, Conflict in Kenya and Africa, with Bruce Berman, Mau Mau and Nationhood, Arms, Authority and Narrative, co-edited with others, and Writing for Kenya, the Life and Work of Henry Muholi, again co-edited with others. He's currently working with Bruce Berman on the intellectual histories of Jomo Kenyatta and Louis Leakey, with a focus on their imagination of Kikuyu ethnicity. And his scholarly career has culminated gloriously in the publication of a chapter on anti-colonial nationalism and patriotism in sub-Saharan Africa in the Oxford Handbook of the History of Nationalism, which I happen to have edited. And John is going to speak on the theme of, did African nationalism continue imperialism's world revolution by other means? And I believe you're going to use some PowerPoint.
I'm going to try. May I also thank the organisers of this conference for having invited me and having forced me to use the technology taught to me by my 8-year-old granddaughter, because although I have resisted PowerPoint for many years, I think if I'm going to try to say quite a lot in a short time, then one needs its assistance. So that's, no, it doesn't work. I start with a question. What, if anything, did the imperial revolution, if it was a revolution, achieve in Africa? What social materials did it bequeath to potential nationalists? What kind of societies could they hope to mobilize? And could there even be any kind of revolutionary potential? Well, I start with a classic quote from my two tutors at Cambridge, one of them a retired bomber pilot and the other a retired tank driver. And in their contribution to the New Cambridge Modern History, published in 1962, it's a wonderful statement, a rather more opaque than Clausewitz, I think, would have approved in its conclusion. But the suggestion that imperialism cuffed traditional peoples out of their tradition into the exchange economy and the bureaucratic state, Western strength hustled them into transformation. One by one they were exposed to rapid social change, the transforming of values. Imperialism has been the engine of social change, but colonial nationalism has been its auxiliary. Between them they have contrived a world revolution. Nationalism has been a continuation of imperialism by other means. Wonderfully grandiloquent and wonderfully opaque. What might they mean? Well, the most ambitious meaning of nationalism as an auxiliary to imperialism's world revolution came from Lord Lugard, the most famous proconsul, now forgotten, in the British Empire, the governor of Nigeria, who wrote a once famous, now forgotten book in 1922, The Dual Mandate in Tropical Africa, with this wonderful self-regarding claim, looking at unrest in both Egypt and in India, if there is unrest and a desire for independence, because we have taught them the value of liberty and of freedom, which for centuries these people had not known. Their very discontent is a measure of their progress. 30 years later, as we shall see, one of his successors as governor of Nigeria was very much less confident in what imperialism could achieve. But what revolutionary claims might imperialists more plausibly make than perhaps Lugard did, and claims that African nationalism might then continue? I suggest possibly 6 claims. First, and I think the most important and most plausible one, would be simply political rationalization. cuffing Africa out of its non-state, pre-state multiplicity of petty kingdoms with very little sovereignty, its very large slave economies, ethnic migrations, all of them really non-states, into 50 colonies, roughly speaking, all of them potential states, as indeed they have since become. And it is, of course, only through statehood that people can conceivably interact with the modern world in anything approaching a degree of equality, of bargaining power. So I think that is the most plausible claim for a revolution in African politics that an imperialist might make. The second claim that they might equally make is that the colonial states provided the infrastructures for markets. Africa being, as most people would think, underpopulated in previous centuries, with very little economic specialization, a great deal of household self-sufficiency, had very limited markets indeed. But colonial harbours, railways, roads, and then the sciences of agriculture and veterinary, Western science, provided the kind of infrastructures that would give Africa the external markets that it did not have internally. Economic historians, I think, would say that the transport revolution was the most important one in Africa. Not only bicycles, which was very good for evangelization, but the railway, which cut the cost of porterage, human porterage, by 90%. And roads cut the cost of railways by another 50%, making it possible for Africa to export primary products which it had not been able to export before. Principally, its principal export previously had been labour, because labour could walk to the coast. With railways reducing the cost of transport, you could begin to export other things like cotton, coffee, palm oil, and so on. So Africa was opened to world markets, not having internal markets of any great size of its own. And then, thirdly, a century before Robinson and Gallagher, Karl Marx had said very much the same thing as they, in 1853, with regard to the British Raj in India, that it had freed labour from inefficient forms of social dependence, in the African case from slavery, from patriarchy. There was a slow death of internal African slavery in the early years of the 20th century. Masters became landlords or patrons. But the principal, I think, economic effect of the reduction of dependence on social hierarchy was the rise of the smallholder peasant. The main export crops could be smallholder crops, whether they were cocoa, coffee, cotton, groundnuts, palm oil, and so on. So a labour market was produced, and the rise of the small man was made possible. Fourthly, another plausible claim was that colonial rule made possible the spread of literacy of a non-specialised sort and the growth of world religions, an enormous enlargement of the imaginative scale that Africans could enjoy. With the import of the Bible, the Quran, with greater access to the Hajj, Africans could read and walk on pilgrimage on their way into world communities out of their very small local communities. Fifthly, there was a great increase in the sum of human happiness if the non-death of infants and mothers is an addition to happiness, as surely it is. Famine relief, the control of epidemics, it's an enormously rapid population growth from around 1920. The continent of Africa experienced a threefold increase in its population in the 20th century, from about 200 million to about 600 million. And nationalism was, above all, a youth movement, a direct outcome of this imperial medicine and the ability to provide famine relief. All these, sixthly, were conditions for capital investment, and therefore perhaps for revolution if new classes were gathered about new means of production. Even left-wing or quasi-Marxist scholars in the 1960s argued that imperialism did not necessarily in Africa lead to underdevelopment, although that was a popular point of view. And my favourite quote in this context comes from the Cambridge Marxist economist Jane Robinson, who used, again to be famous, around 1950, the misery of being exploited by capitalists. She suggested this is nothing to the misery of not being exploited at all, as Africans were not, at least not by capitalists, before colonial rule. Now, all those changes brought about, as it is claimed, or could be claimed before imperialism, have of course been argued and disputed. So, what were the more plausible realities rather than claims? Take the first, political rationalisation, which I said was probably the most important of imperialism's claims. Africans themselves made their own political rationalisations, and those were by and large not at the state level, not at the national, or not at the potentially national level, but at what we've come to call the ethnic level, or what some people rather rudely call the sub-national level. When the British prided themselves on something called indirect rule, that was merely masking their inability to do anything other than to persuade Africans that the ethnic group was the group that was the civilizing agent, the socializing agent in this new imperial world. It's a gross generalization, but generally speaking, what have very often been very loose associations of culture and language and economic specialization became very much more sharply defined under colonial rule, partly as units of local defense, partly for other reasons, largely because of the next 4 points on my slide. Because the next claim, the provision of market infrastructures, while true, I think most people would now say merely opened Africa to the possibility of producing quite simple primary products, largely vegetable ones, and therefore made it extremely vulnerable to changing global terms of trade. It's true that it's difficult to see what the economic alternatives were. There were, of course, considerable mining enclaves in parts of Africa, largely in the south, but it was difficult to see how one could increase incomes, provide the beginnings of any kind of state organization without the export of primary, simple primary products to the outside world. But while the economic arguments are debatable, I think the political effects of this dependence on primary production are fairly certain, in that one got the growth of regional specializations according to whatever ecology was suitable, either for cocoa or for coffee or for cotton, groundnuts and so on, so that one got groundnutting tribes, cocoa-growing tribes, and so on, with their own marketing organizations, which were also the basis later of political organizations. So that not only was ethnicity a political rationalization, it was very often an economic infrastructure as well in colonial Africa. This regional specialization, thirdly, led to, yes, a freeing of labor, as Marx had praised a century earlier, but it was largely migrant labor from poorer, more distant regions, those which could not get access to railhead or to roads to export whatever it is that they could grow, largely from drier regions, notoriously from French West Africa, light soils, as Lord Salisbury called them in the 1890s, migrating south to the wetter, more forested areas of British West Africa, Ghana, Nigeria. So that there was little stabilization of a proletariat largely from African choice. They wanted to keep their rural roots. And this largely migrant labour had much the same effect on ethnicity as crop specialisation. Chain migrations from one part of Africa to another led to the growth of welfare associations to protect these migrants, long before trade unions were made legal by nervous colonial governments. So again, migrant labour had the same effect, I think, on the hardening of ethnic identities. The fourth claim about literacy and the opening of imaginations to the wider world. That opening was brought largely by vernacular Bibles. By Bibles translated by devoted missionaries, Protestant missionaries, who thought that people could only be Christians if they could read God's Word, supposedly in their own language, which meant that ethnic imaginations were marvellously enlarged to model themselves on what Adrian Hastings calls the prototype ethnic nation, the children of Israel. And it is extraordinary if one looks at myths of ethnogenesis, particularly in Eastern Africa now, how often they start in Exodus. We all migrated from Egypt, as of course did the children of Israel, the first ethnic nation to really capture the global imagination. And the same is very much true of Islam, because Islam spread certainly in West Africa and in the East, largely by the mechanism of Islamic brotherhoods following local saints. These are precisely the forms of very locally focused Islam, which are now most grossly under attack from more fundamentalist Muslims in the Sahel region, as we have seen more recently. So I think the idea of opening up African imaginations to a wider world is true, but provided one makes the proviso that it was a very local sense of placing oneself in the world that was, I think, encouraged. The fifth claim of imperialism resulted in such a rapid population growth as has never been seen elsewhere in world history. And I don't know whether Arthur would agree with me that the collapse of imperial China in the 19th century was caused largely by very rapid population growth. Africa's population growth in the 20th century was still more rapid. So a very equivocal process. It created youthful energies, but it also vastly increased the dependency ratio. No state in the world, no colonial state, no post-colonial state could cope, so that dependent youth increasingly looked back to ethnic supports, and alas now ethnic youth militias are all too easily created out of the unemployed. The sixth point is that if colonial states were potentially international actors, they were also incredibly weak, as was illustrated particularly by the failures of late colonial state capitalist development in the era of the Cold War. The best known example of failure, of course, is the expenditure of £50 to £60 million on the groundnut scheme. £50 to £60 million in 1950 being rather a large sum of money. Not a single groundnut was produced. But something was produced, and that was the Land Rover, but for reasons which I haven't got time to go into, but could be questioned on. So there was perhaps some benefit, but not the one that was expected. And these economic failures were spectacular in African opinion at precisely the time when, in Cold War politics, Africans were looking at five-year plans in Russia adopted by India and wondering whether there wasn't altogether very much more effective form of development than what was being imposed upon them by colonial rulers. So, given what I've just suggested, a twofold argument for decolonisation arose out of imperial weakness as much as out of the strength of any nationalist opposition. First, if colonies were no gold mine and couldn't even produce groundnuts but indeed a drain, and would become still more of a drain if one had to fight to keep them. Then, secondly, the quicker one got out, conceding to friendly African nationalism before they looked too closely to the east, would be very much in the West's advantage. So that Lugard's successor in 1955, governor of Nigeria, obviously a very tired man, inevitably the people are going to be disillusioned. It's better that they be disillusioned as a result of the failure of their own people to whom they can hand over than as a result of our actions. Quoted in a marvellous brief book by Frederick Cooper, Africa Since 1940, published by the Cambridge University Press. So let me just summarise where I think I've got to so far, that the role of imperialism, the kind of social materials that we hand over to nationalism, were extremely ambiguous. Two negative points one can make, in that while in 1890 it was reckoned that Africa occupied about 2% of international trade, it occupied the same percentage in 1960. Of course, global trade had expanded enormously in that time, but this is scarcely a revolution. Or if one looks at technology, a more mixed picture here, I think, the transport revolution was undoubtedly extremely important in making it possible to export products rather than labour. But it has also been said that the African peasant went into colonial rule with the hoe and came out of colonial rule with the hoe. There was enormous expansion of labour time, but not labour efficiency, and the burden fell chiefly on women. Yet, there are some perhaps more positive things to be said. African elites, a very small number of course, were by now globally experienced. Léopold Senghor, the first president of Senegal, went to the same lycée as Georges Pompidou, president of France. Kwame Nkrumah and Ben Azikiwe, first presidents of Ghana and Nigeria, respectively, learnt a great deal of their political energy in their American universities. Jomo Kenyatta learnt in very short order that he was not a communist when he went to Moscow in 1930, when he told his communist tutors, "Liberal imperialism offers more freedom of thought than you do." Julius Nyerere's policies in Tanzania cannot be understood, I don't think, when separated from his education in Edinburgh. Tom Mboya, the trade union leader in Kenya, was an enormously powerful man simply because the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions based in the USA saw him as a wonderful weapon against the World Federation of Trade Unions based in Russia. There's an article, Why Does Mandela Read Shakespeare? Which is very interesting, but even more interesting, I think, is the fact that his rival, Robert Sobukwe, of the Azania Liberation Front in apartheid South Africa, whenever they got into trouble, they said to themselves, "Let us remember the words of Horatius from Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome. How can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods?" These people, who colonial rulers wanted to keep as native subjects, were becoming global citizens, which I think is hugely important in giving them the kind of confidence that they needed. And of course, fourthly, Africans had actually become international actors. In the scramble for Africa, not a single African was consulted. It was all done in the Congress of Berlin, lines drawn on the map. With decolonisation, Africans were wooed by the British, backed partly by the Americans, because they were also being wooed, of course, from Russia and China. But fifthly, and global trade and finance should really be in five, the real strings of power were, of course, still held in Western hands, and there had been no profound social or institutional transformations, I don't think. Patronage remained the main access to the state, as it had remained the main access to land or to marriage in pre-colonial Africa, bypassing any kind of top-down reforms such as a late colonial legislature, an independent judiciary, and so on. Regional equalities that had grown up in the past 70 years led to ethnic resentments. There are problems, therefore, for any nationalism, let alone revolutionary nationalism. Could you possibly create a nationalism of solidarity that created new rights and mutual obligations, or the kind of citizenry alert to its rights that could maintain any kind of political accountability? So, to get towards the punchlines, what could one expect after all this but very ambiguous forms of nationalism? They faced, I think, 5 difficulties. The first and the most fundamental, and the one which one could actually stop, is the fact that authority in African society lay very clearly with propertied rural males. Household management everywhere is seen as the key, I think, to public authority. It was the moral value of stateless society which Africans had inherited. Set against that youthful, and even worse, female energy in towns, and you've got very real conflicts of ideas and concepts within most African nationalisms, if that is what they should be called. And Tom Mboya, the man I've already mentioned, the Labour leader in Kenya, secondly, drew, I think, a very interesting consequence from this fundamental tension or conflict of authority, that he argued in his book Freedom and After, that while you could have debate about the roles of authority, the relations between patrons and clients, who owed what to whom in ethnic public spheres, that was simply something you could not tolerate before independence in a nationalist movement, because it would create far too many divisions of opinion and split a nationalist movement, which the colonialists, cunning as ever, would no doubt exploit. So that there was a fundamental, I think, shallowness of any kind of nationalist opinion of ideas, other than the obvious slogans of freedom now and so on, before independence. So there's very little idea of what sort of a future a nationalist movement could itself try to generate. Thirdly, I think far from a national solidarity arising within colonial boundaries, the regional inequalities which I've mentioned meant that there were inevitably vanguard movements from people better educated, richer. Politics costs money, and only if you are a profitable cocoa grower can you afford to invest in a bus to take people to rallies, can you afford to contribute to a party and its press and so on. So there were bound to be vanguard movements which would set on edge resentments of weaker, poorer regions who had then developed defensive local sovereignties of their own, a very common phenomenon indeed in late colonial Africa. And there was also very little Pan-African solidarity either, because of very different experiences of these different anti-colonial movements. If you were in French West Africa and British West Africa, you had extraordinarily different institutions with which to practice your politics, much stronger local governments in British West Africa, for instance, than in West. The experience of non-settler and settler colonies was obviously very different too, and the legal constitutional nationalisms which by and large won power in non-settler Africa were totally and utterly different and largely uncomprehending, I think, of the militant guerrilla nationalisms that were necessary to get rid of the much more obdurate Portuguese or in Algeria and in Rhodesia. Finally, I think, and fifthly, nationalist leaders had every reason for nervousness. There were very few really confident, I think, nationalist leaders, despite their bombast. Very conscious, I think, of the insecurities of power, terrified by how easy it was to get rid of the imperial powers, how easy might it be for others to get rid of them, as indeed most of them were, of course, ousted from power within a very few years of independence by their very small armies. They were running statist economies with government marketing boards for everything you could possibly think of, and facing rising expectations from the populace to whom they had preached the benefits of independence, with an extraordinarily weak administrative apparatus. As the governor of Nigeria had forecast, their disillusionments were going to mount, and they were going to be the ones to be blamed. Nonetheless, however, one shouldn't belittle all that they did achieve. There was an extraordinary advances, I think, in welfare before the 1973 oil crisis, a decade of independence, when the terms of trade largely favourable to Africa before then were overturned. Great increases in literacy and life expectancy, a great decrease in infant mortality, much epidemic disease was also tamed. So finally, if African nationalisms were very ambiguous, so too were any possibilities, I think, for any revolution. 5 varieties, I think. But first, I think one has to demolish the ideas of Franz Fanon, the best-known theorist of anti-colonial revolution, as the only true nationalism. Speaking of his experience in Algeria, Franz Fanon's vision was that violence and liberation war would unify a divided people from below, give them the same kind of burning experience. It would re-educate their elites. It would force them to go to school with the peasants who were practicing their guerrilla war. Going to school with peasants, not with Georges Pompidou. But the reality, I think, if one looks at Algeria, Zimbabwe, Angola, Mozambique, is that guerrilla war actually fragmented opinion and organisation even more than constitutional nationalism did, and gave rise, therefore, to a very authoritarian post-colonial rule, needing to destroy its quite well-armed adversaries. And indeed, I think South Africa can consider itself very lucky that it collapsed from within, with township violence rather than guerrilla exile violence from outside. So, with that kind of caution, what other varieties of revolution might there be other than the kind of anti-colonial revolutionary violence that one resulted in Robert Mugabe? Well, the first and the most general, of course, was the revolution of the bureaucratic bourgeoisie, as Marxist commentators rather dismissively called it at the time. But this was perhaps the truest continuity of imperialism, that the literate minority took over the state as only they knew how to organise it. Not the kind of bourgeois revolution that would lead to other forms of revolution, as Marxists thought, but the truest continuity, I guess, with imperialism. Another very debatable form of revolution in late colonial times was intra-ethnic, particularly the Mama rising amongst the Gikuyu people, which I myself have written a bit on, and which is has been much in the news recently. But far from the peasant beating the patron, the chief achievement of Mama, I think, was not so much Kenya's independence as Kenya's independence under a particularly battle-hardened loyalist elite who knew how to keep people under control. A third form of revolution that one saw was inter-ethnic, but also had class characteristics, when the Hutu of Rwanda rose against their Tutsi overlords in 1959, just at the moment of independence. When the Hutu had, for the colonial period, been treated largely as an underclass, first by the Germans and by the Belgians, who had encouraged the Tutsi to act as overlords. But then when a second generation of Catholic missionaries came in with Catholic socially progressive ideas and started educating the Hutu, then there was a counter-elite which led Hutu peasants against Tutsi overlords, particularly ruthless form of violence, which, alas, has done little more than repeat itself since in alternate ways. While there were ethnic nationalisms, the Biafran War most catastrophically, the Katangan secession, the inability of Uganda to know what to do with the kingdom of Buganda at its midst, raising very fundamental questions which nobody dared answer about what were the limits of self-determination. Who had the right of self-determination in post-colonial Africa? A question which has been swept largely under the carpet. Or there was the Fabian Revolution, the one which everybody loved. We were all Tanzafires once. When Julius Nyerere, having read his Fabian Socialists, having imbibed Scottish social equalities in Edinburgh, tried to impose peasant cooperation on an extremely unwilling peasant population in Tanzania. He simply didn't understand his peasants, who are profoundly unequal in their society, but expect inequality to be matched by mutual obligation as between patron and client, and the last thing they want to do is to cooperate with others in managing their own households. He was greatly misled, I'm afraid, Julius Nyerere, by his Scottish education. None of these could be thought to be revolutionary successes, whether economically or socially, but echoing Zhou Enlai and his opinion on the French Revolution, I think one would say it's obviously far too soon to tell. We're talking about matters only 70 years ago. Nationalism of the bureaucratic sort, the bureaucratic bourgeois revolution, I think, had failed by the 1990s. But allied with a new, more efficient imperialism, China's, it appears that Africa's growth rate has far exceeded expectations, certainly much better than Europe, but that would be difficult. More important, and Kenya is the country I think I know best, Kenyans went through a very disputed, probably fraudulent election only 2 or 3 months ago. 5 years ago, when they experienced the same, they killed each other. This time they have not. They have adopted a new constitution which has devolved power, has separated powers, has greatly decentralized the powers of the presidency. They are beginning to learn to negotiate together. And this, it seems to me, is the story of the beginning, perhaps, of a national culture. So, on that possibly hopeful note, I end. Thank you.